Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time out this morning to join us. My name is Jenny Wilde, and I'm a partner in the healthcare and regulatory team at Acuity Law. And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing today's session on managing a crisis in health and social care. Before I introduce our wonderful panel, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit and frame what we'll be discussing today. So over the past 15 years, I've been advising health and social care providers on various matters, and I've seen the full spectrum of regulatory issues, from relatively minor inspection points like gaps in record keeping or staffing ratios, all the way to serious incidents, including safeguarding failures and tragically deaths. What I've learned is that crises rarely appear overnight. They do, but that's rare. Often, it's actually a series of small issues that go unaddressed, misdocumentation step here, a delayed response there, and that gradually escalates into regulatory scrutiny. Conversely, I've also seen providers respond quickly, methodically, and transparently, and successfully prevent what could have been a full-blown crisis. Even a requires improvement rating can trigger follow-up inspections and reputational risk if not managed carefully. Allegations, complaints, or negative media coverage can compound regulatory attention in ways that do feel sudden, but are often predictable. The first 24 to 72 hours of a crisis are critical, and getting governance, communications, and evidence management right from the start can shape the outcome dramatically. So what are we going to be discussing today? I think a good starting point is that crises exist on a spectrum. As I mentioned, we can go from really minor regulatory breaches or inspection findings up to operational missteps, up to safeguarding incidents, and then all the way to the most serious harm or death. And all of these can trigger regulatory scrutiny, whether it's CQC, Ofsted, CIW, or CI. It can attract media attention and reputational risk, but the principles of crisis management remain consistent. The idea is to stabilise the situation, gather accurate evidence, and communicate clearly and maintain governance oversight. Now, today's session will explore these principles from three perspectives. So I'm here to bring the legal and regulatory foundations. I'm a solicitor practicing in health and social care regulation with experience of managing prosecutions, CQC enforcement action, inquests, and safeguarding matters. And what I want you to do is understand how to respond to crises defensively. Then we're going to have a discussion on operational management, stabilising services on the ground. And then we're going to bring in the perspective of crisis communications, so protecting and rebuilding that trust with your various stakeholders. So we do have an active Q&A function that you'll be able to see at the top of your screen. Please feel free to fire in your questions throughout. I'm going to chair this meeting and bring those in at appropriate points in the discussion. So this now brings me to my wonderful colleagues in today's webinar who have joined us from different disciplines, and that's going to give a really good perspective for all of you providers. First of all, we have Lucy Corner and Charlie Light. Lucy is the Managing Director and Charlie is the Operations Manager of Cornerstone Care Solutions. Lucy and Charlie specialise in operational turnaround and due diligence across adults and social services, and children's services. And they bring extensive hands-on experience across that area, working directly with services under pressure, implementing recovery plans, stabilising teams, and embedding compliance frameworks. And what they're going to do today is provide the frontline operational perspective, showing really what crisis can look like in practice. And then we'll be joined at the end of the session by Saoirse Brennan with her communications perspective. Saoirse is a director at 8HWE and she specialises in reputation management, public affairs, crisis communications and stakeholder engagement. We're going to have a session with Saoirse at the end that will cover the protect, promote and prevent framework and give some really, really useful advice to providers on how to manage such crises. So, from a regulatory perspective, the frameworks that can shape crisis management across the UK really bring into play our regulators. So we've got the Care Quality Commission, Care Inspectorate Wales, the Regulation and Quality Improvement Authority of Northern Ireland, Ofsted, and the Care Inspectorate in Scotland. So what we're going to be using as a foundation is activity around those regulators that can trigger incidents, and they become involved in your provision, and that can lead to a crisis. So those legal frameworks set the parameters, but operational response will determine whether risk escalates. So I think a really sensible place to start here is by bringing Lucy and Charlie into the management sphere, looking at things on the ground and getting that operational perspective. So Lucy and Charlie, thank you so much for joining us.
More than welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think let's take your experience anecdotally, and you have so much on the ground experience and stories to tell, maybe as a warning to people joining the call today. But I think let's start from the beginning. When you're called into a service in crisis, what are the very first operational priorities that you look at in the opening hours?
Well, first and foremost, any service we go into, whether it be predominantly health, children, adult, is always look at the safety of the people who use that service first. They are your main priority. No matter what the crisis is in that home, the outcome should always be how it impacts on the people using that service. So first and foremost, check every single person that uses that service and have a plan to make sure they are safe, comfortable, and the crisis is not going to impact them any further. That is ultimately the first step before you even look at anything else. The second step really would then be to look at the support systems around the crisis. So again, whether it's organisational or whether it's person element crisis, looking at what outside agencies do you need to involve in planning for managing this crisis, whether it's external support, whether it's actually communicating further in the organisation. You may have sister homes if you're a provider, you may have multiple resources across the group that you can think, okay, who are we going to need to bring in to manage this crisis with us? And then the third step is a crisis management plan, a risk management plan, let's call it. So, you know, having that risk management plan and using people to come into that to decide who is going to be accountable for different areas of that plan. Because as we all know in health and social care, when crisis hits the fan, we all panic straight away. And you think, oh, how are we going to deal with this? Who are we going to have to get involved? How's it going to impact? Whether it's, you know, how's the reputation of the home? We just think about everything. Now, we need to share that risk so that we can concentrate on individual areas of the crisis. Because if you have one person trying to manage a whole crisis, it will never become a recovery situation. You will always be just managing and firefighting that crisis. So making a risk management plan, making sure people in that plan know what they're accountable for, they're able to update on that, and there's one person leading that crisis. The more people leading a crisis, the harder it's going to be to maintain and hold everyone accountable for that. You have to do this as a business agreement. You know, we have the right people in the business, or we have external people that we've brought in to help the people in the business, and this is now what we're going to do. And that's your basic day one. Make sure that you have a plan, because you're going to have to communicate that plan for the crisis to be solved.
Amazing. Thank you. And I think when something does happen, and let's use the example that the worst possible case scenario is that somebody passes away in difficult circumstances. That's something that I deal with regularly, and that can attract lots of attention from lots of different stakeholders. So we're talking commissioners, safeguarding, the police, the family, everyone, the regulator. So I think things can feel quite high adrenaline and rushed, and providers might feel that they have to really go at something quite quickly in order to seem proactive. But why do you think it's important to really take a minute and slow down and look at your documents before taking action?
So this is a really important point. It's something that we try and explain to providers before they have a crisis, so that they don't knee-jerk react and just suddenly send information into the ether that either might make their situation worse, but might actually not support the argument that they're trying to put across. And when I say argument, I mean any part of the situation that they're involved in. They may need to evidence what they're doing to improve things. They may need to look into an investigation and see what happened in say in your example, if somebody was to pass away. It might be that they've had an information request or pressure to put an urgent action plan into place. And what we often see is that providers rush to put together an action plan and it doesn't cover all the points, or it's really weak. And I know Charlie just mentioned there that, you know, you would use a smart system of making sure that you've got your people allocated to that job, that all of the actions are measurable and achievable and time bound. If those things are not put into the action plan when you send it, then that just gives a negative view of that organisation, and it shows the weakness that they already have if they don't have somebody that can put together a good action plan. And not just talking about action plans, if you had an incident where they're asking you for your investigation, for example, or we want all the governance information from this certain situation, we often find that providers gather all the information and they have all these audits and things that, you know, they think really helps them, and they just send them to CQC, but they haven't sat down and read them to look at what they mean or what they say. And to give you a really good example to highlight that, we recently worked with a provider who had an incident with IPC, and they'd had a couple of admissions to hospital for various outbreak issues. And CQC were worried that they'd potentially had many people pass away through infections. And they asked for all the information, governance documents, and other bits and bobs that the service had. And when we got involved, we asked to see all of the things that they'd sent to CQC. And one of the things they'd sent was quite an interesting infection tracker. So it had every resident's name on it. It had which infection they might have had, what antibiotics they had, when they were started. Quite a good idea for a nursing home. Something that we don't often see is people tracking KPIs. So, you know, that shows some forward thinking. But the manager had been using this tracker, and at the end of each column, it covered the whole home. And at the end of each column, when a person passed away, they just wrote RIP in the final column. And CQC used that information to insinuate then that the information the provider had given them basically said that all of the people with those infections had passed away because of those infections. So they ended up then coming back to them and saying, well, now you've given us evidence that X amount of people in X amount of months have passed away due to these infections, and we're now taking this, you know, further. So we've ended up then having to go and do a counter investigation to go and find evidence that supports actually the death certificates say this, or these things, you know, prove that these people didn't have that. And that just created a lot more work than if they hadn't sent that tracker, or if they'd sent the tracker with a synopsis of this is what this means. And, you know, the RIP at the end of the column, you know, could be no longer at the service, or, you know, discharged on whatever date or whatever that might be. But rather than making it look like everyone on that tracker either had an infection or died, caused, you know, some detrimental issues there. So it's really important not to panic and to look through exactly what information you're sending, and that it gives the right impression. And that's not to say, you know, we would never want somebody to make up information or be not be transparent. And I know we're covering a bit more on that on communication later, but making sure that you're open and transparent is really important. But the clear communication and making sure that the points that you need to get over are got over is more important than just bombarding them with information to look like a provider might think that bombarding with information is a good thing and it shows being proactive, but that's not always the case.
No, I agree. And I think it comes from a good place. I think a provider probably thinks, I'm going to be completely open and transparent. I'll send you everything I have. But there can be things in there that raise more questions about a separate issue than the regulator ever asked. I had a case with a provider that was challenging requires improvement inspection report through the factual accuracy process and submitted some supporting evidence that challenged what the CQC had said. And that wasn't done through me. And then after the fact, it turned out that they had submitted evidence that raised questions about poor record keeping, and I think it was hydration, and that hadn't been picked up by the CQC at all. But because they had delivered that in trying to prove a separate point, that was then included in the inspection report, and that particular domain went down to inadequate. And that's during the factual accuracy process, what people don't realise is that the rating can go down as well as be increased. So really drilling down on what you're providing, you have to focus it on the specific point that you're trying to challenge. And this goes for any type of a crisis. Are you answering the question that's being asked? And another example, Lucy, which you and I have discussed before, is the massive increase in CQC prosecutions.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a spike in CQC writing to providers to say, colloquially, we're thinking about, we're thinking about prosecuting you.
As you know, in April 2015, we were given powers to prosecute.
That's it, exactly. And it can be up to 3 years ago. And actually, the CQC is considering prosecuting with no time limits. So you really ought to be keeping good records on these kind of crisis incidents that happen, making sure that even the historical incidents are answered. But also when the CQC come knocking and say to you, we're going to start looking at this, can you give us all of your documentation? This is a criminal investigation. If you were being taken to the police station, and this is the same domain here, you would immediately contact a lawyer, because anything that you provide will be taken as evidence and used against you potentially. So my bottom line as the lawyer on that would be, make sure you've had somebody look at what you're providing, testing its validity, and looking at it from every potential perspective, especially in a prosecution scenario. But I think your point is a really good one. It's good to be helpful, but it's more important to be targeted and really clear on what you're providing, and does it meet the aim of providing the evidence, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So thinking about the crisis has happened, whatever it may be, you guys are there on the ground helping to sort things out. How would a provider go from that situation, so crisis mode, which is very high octane, it's pacey, how do you go from that into recovery without losing that positive momentum?
Yeah, that's so important. So when you think about a crisis itself, a crisis shouldn't be a crisis really for more than 72 hours, because that's the crisis time frame. You're getting everyone together, you're looking at what you need to do. You've got those kind of 3 days to think, right, we now know what we're doing. So we know what the crisis is, we've got a plan, we know who our accountable people are, we know what resources we need. So now we're looking at, how do we now recover from the crisis? Because what people normally do, and this is when you hear providers come to us, and we see it all the time, where they're saying, we're just firefighting the same things over and over. And that's because we've dealt with the crisis, but we're not recovered from it. So we've put a plaster on, we've not put a treatment plan in place. And that's what your recovery plan is, really, if you're talking to kind of clinical terms. You get a skin tear, you put a plaster on, as soon as you take that plaster off, the skin's going to tear again. If you put a treatment plan in place and you use the correct bandages and the correct treatment and the correct time frames, that's going to heal, and it's going to manage, and it's not going to happen again. So I think it's about thinking of your recovery plan the same as we deal with everyday things in our organisations. So your recovery plan is an action plan that actually is active. It's not we're going to quickly do this action, sign it off complete, we're happy with it. No, we're going to learn from this crisis. We're going to embed the changes we're going to do. So when CQC, Ofsted come to you, I had this with Ofsted, with a provider I support at the moment, and Ofsted were like, okay, so we want this to be done in 2 weeks. Absolutely not. So if you're going to embed something, you're going to look at, you're telling them how long it's going to take. Okay, so we've had a death, let's say. This death, there's been some errors. I'm currently supporting, again, another provider. There's been some errors with how documentation was recorded, which has then led to questions, okay, about staff competence and all of this kind of thing. So let's use that as an example. So from that, to recover from that, we have to have a clear plan in place. We have to retrain staff. We have to recompetency them. We have to embed record keeping. We have to change culture of record keeping. That's not going to happen in 2 weeks. Your average is 3 to 6 months for a clear recovery plan to actually embed that change and learn that lesson and clearly evidence that you've done that. So again, when you have a recovery team, they know who's accountable. They know who's managing those actions. It's actually using it as a live document rather than a ticky box, which unfortunately what we've seen, and I know, Jenny, we've worked on people in the past where, you know, they provide this action plan. They say, yeah, this is complete, this is complete, this is complete. You go in a month later, you know, we've got an NOP, we're going in a month later, we know CQC is due back out. And yes, the actions were completed, but they're exactly the same now a month later because there's been no learning and embedded. So when we talk about a recovery plan, it's a learning plan for the organisation, for the home. And if we learn it in one home, and this is where a crisis is different to recovery. So a crisis we deal with in those first 3 days, we get a grip on it, we make a plan. A recovery plan is changing it in every area within your organisation. If you have a crisis in one home, you embed that change in all homes, whether it's 7 to 30 to 70. So that's your recovery plan as an organisation, not just fixing the crisis itself. That's the difference, and that's how important it is. And it's not a quick fix.
Yeah, I've seen that so many times, and it's called not sustaining change or embedding change. And I think, do you have any practical tips, Charlie, to kind of, what does embedding and sustaining look like? And, you know, it might be supervisions, training, not to answer your question for you, but I think for the people on the call, it would be useful to hear practical examples of this nebulous concept that regulators throw out a lot. It's you have not embedded change. And really, how do you do it?
Yeah, so I'll give again an example. I'm currently supporting a group of young people homes. So used to be Ofsted and have gone to CQC. So there's a little bit of change there around how they evidence regulation. But the actual care is the same. You know, the care we're giving these young people are the same. So what we've had to do is there's been some areas of concern that have been brought up by the regulator. So when we're looking to change a culture, it's looking at one, training first. What skill set do these people need in this service to understand what they're accountable for these young people and how they evidence that? Training is 20 to 30% of fixing something. You're literally just giving people information when you train them. Then you've got to look at the coaching element. So looking at the competency base, the coaching after that training. So, you know, you made reference there to fluid, you know, earlier, and fluid intake not being, you know, reported correctly, and that caused further issues. If the staff know the understandings of that, they understand the science behind the nutrition, what it impacts on wound care, on, you know, musts, on water lows, on everything, then we've given them that information. We're then going to test them. We're going to competence them. We have the right to do that as employers. I get tested. I have to recertify. If you're a nurse, you have to revalidate. We all, in a professional setting, have to recompetize and also re-skill ourselves, because things change all the time. And just because legislation hasn't changed doesn't mean the way we evidence how we do things hasn't changed. It does. All regulators are changing how we evidence things. You know what it's like, CQC, RQIA, they'll come in 2 years ago, and how you evidence something 2 years ago is not how they want to evidence now. So it's about competency. And then it's ongoing. You will never fix something if you don't continuously support and change. We've been working with a home at the moment. The manager, she is so experienced. She's been in care for 30 years. She's, you know, she has those residents she supports at her heart. However, they've identified that even managers need retraining. and they need re-coaching into the way social care expects us to evidence and behave now. So when you're embedding something, it has to be ongoing and continuous. It's not just going to be 3-6 months. That's your recovery time. Your actual embedding will continue on for years to come.
Yeah, I think you're right. And just to bring it back to that point about the manager and leaders, I think it takes a really strong leader to take a team and say this went badly wrong. We are all responsible. There'll obviously be some side disciplinary processes, which, I've worked with our employment team on a few of those, and crisis often emanates from staff failings. But then it's about moving on and moving the team with you. But also something I see a lot of is maybe a failure to comprehensively and consistently complete audits that would identify those patterns prior to a crisis, but even after a crisis. And I guess the buzz phrase would be, how do we avoid this ever happening again? So I suppose, Lucy, it might be something around the fail-safe systems, the learning. So the training is a massive piece of it, but then after the fact, it's kind of acknowledging that this happened and reflecting on avoidance of a repeat.
Completely. And for us going into services, we're the person that comes in to do that kind of independent checking a lot of times. So hopefully it's before a crisis and somebody's noticed that maybe things are slipping and they want us to come out and do some kind of review or check their checkers or check their managers. Hopefully they already have a governance system in place, which is a system where you have audits, KPIs, you have different levels of people checking things in the organisation, and then the people above them are going and checking those checks randomly and taking small portions of those audits to make sure that things are being done about them. I know Charlie alluded to the fact that lots of audits are tick box exercises, and often an audit will have a list of questions, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and the staff in the home have ticked these off, and that isn't in place or that is in place, but there's no column that's updated to say this is what I've done about finding that this isn't in place, or actually this is a yes but it's not quite a full yes because. And making sure that you have a column and you're documenting those things shows the embedding that we're talking about, that if you do have actions where something isn't quite complete or it's slipping from the previous audit, then the systems need to make sure that they flag those things, but then in the following audit you're showing improvement. So if you flick back through, say, 3 or 6 months, those audits should track and prove that if something is brought up and you find that, I don't know, the fridge temperature isn't at the right temperature, the next time you do that audit, that should be rectified, or there should be a plan in place to say the reason for the fridge temperature not being correct is this, and this is what we've done about it. We've moved the medications to a different fridge while we order a new one, for example. And these are the things about embedding systems that are really important for providers to show continuous learning and to evidence not just that the staff are taking on training and implementing the training that they're getting, but that they're thinking and using their common sense and having the space to look at things from a different angle rather than firefighting in a crisis situation. So it's a luxury to have that time and be able to do that, but it's the chicken and egg thing. If you don't have that system in place, you will probably end up with some sort of crisis. So we often pull our hair out when we're speaking to providers saying, if you'd have just got us in, we would have told you that these things are quite big risks and given you a plan. And actually lots of the time we take calls and give advice for free just because we want to support providers in making sure that they're looking after people, and that's our key kind of ethos really, is we want people to get the best care, and making sure these systems in place are the key way of doing that.
I think we have a slightly skewed view, don't we? Because Cornerstone, you specialise in turning around. I specialise in dealing with enforcement action. So we see people in really stressful enforcement and serious situations. And it usually does come from a lack of proactivity or just a small detail that was missing. And that can happen to the best of us. But I think those providers that we don't see a lot of are those that have really effective and comprehensive systems, but also the right people executing them. And I think that that's the difference, isn't it? It's making sure that the structures are there, the frameworks are there, but those responsible, as you mentioned, Charlie, people taking ownership and actively making sure that things move forward and there is a recovery is what gets you through those difficult times. Great, that's really helpful. So we've had the crisis, we're in recovery mode. If you could give, reflecting on all of that, if you could give the providers on this call one piece of operational advice, and they were facing a crisis tomorrow, what would that piece of advice be?
Are you going first, Charlie?
Yeah, I can go first. That's fine.
I saw you on mute. Go on.
Yeah, so for me, as I said at the beginning, when it's day one of that crisis, get help, get your team together, because without them, it's just going to get messy. You need to be organised and you need to have a plan. So if you were having a crisis tomorrow, today, make a plan of who you're going to bring in to support with that crisis, whether it be internal or external, but have a plan, have a list of people, a tree of support.
I would build on that and say, don't panic. I would say, take a step back. I'm chill. Charlie's the doer. She'll get in there and gets things sorted. I'm like, okay, let's take stock. Let's look at what we've got, what we're dealing with, what resources have we got, how big is this problem and how deep is it, how wide is it, how many different areas does it affect, and then start to pull everything together to say, okay, well, we can deal with this in however many different ways, and you know, are there concurrent activities that we can put in place so that things happen quicker? So one of the things in crisis management that I really like is the problem solving side of it, and you know, using the time to the best of your ability. So if you have got different things that you could be doing, and I know Charlie mentioned earlier giving different tasks to different people, you can use the kind of Gantt chart system where you have more things happening at once so that you're not wasting time and you're having the maximum impact with the shortest period of time and the lowest amount of resources. Obviously, sometimes that means drafting people in, and it also means bringing in team members such as lawyers, such as consultants, and it might mean bringing managers or people from other services. But demonstrating that there's that system and support in place not only will help improve the crisis or the problem quicker and give some assurance to CQC or whichever regulator it is that's coming in, or local authority, but also it gives the staff that feeling of support as well, which a lot of people overlook. In a crisis, we don't look at the manager and the team and go, okay, this isn't your fault, or it might be, you know, let's you know, hold you for a minute and give you the validation that you need, or let's, you know, reflect on how things happen really quickly to give you the time that you need to feel secure in your job. But actually we need everybody to be pulling in the same direction, and if you don't have that, then obviously, as you've mentioned, there may be those disciplinary processes or performance management PIPs, etc., that may need to be fed into that as well. But making sure that we take the team into account is really important too, so that we know that they're going to help and not hinder that process.
That's so important, Lucy, isn't it? Because that's the culture. If you can make all the promises and policies that you like, but if people aren't going to execute them on the ground, then it simply isn't going to work. So I suppose it's about getting that buy-in from the team and them having confidence in you. Just to touch on that, well, thank you for that, Jen, by the way. I think that's good advice to everybody. But I think from a legal perspective, in terms of crisis, something that we've had to deal with a lot in recent years is an increase in notice of proposal to cancel registrations or remove locations from any regulator, actually. Everybody's kind of going to that really high end of enforcement. To succeed in challenging those proceedings, the best thing that one can do is demonstrate, if things were that bad and you agree with that, you need to be able to demonstrate how you have changed and why things won't revert to the way that they were when the regulator decided to take this action. We've spoken at length this morning about these systems, recordings, charts, but if you don't document it, if you don't have it there in a really clear and concise or understandable way, then it simply doesn't exist to the regulator. They won't really acknowledge what you're doing unless they can tangibly see it and read it on paper. So my message to anybody on this call in a crisis is look at your documentation, because that could be the thing that saves you through enforcement processes. Because remember, you would be doing a representation against a proposal to cancel your registration. You might then have a decision, and that goes into a tribunal process. So a judge who has never seen this case before, has nothing to do with CQC, will need to be able to read this story, the story of your service and its challenges, from start to finish. The start being the crisis, the finish being the resolution, and that's the tools that you have devised to get you through this challenge and turn around your service. So the best strategy is documenting everything. When you've got your strategy in mind, making sure it's all there with a neat little bow on it so that you can provide it to whoever needs to see it. Lucy and Charlie, that's been really helpful. Thank you so much. Before we go to Sasha, I'm going to remind everybody, if you do have a question about anything that we're discussing, please pop it in the comments. We can discuss at the end of the session. And if there are no questions, I'm just going to chat a little bit more to the panel, so don't worry. So we've had the legal and operational considerations. Those are vital, but crises rarely remain internal. Now, Sasha, over to you to guide us through communications and the protect, promote, prevent strategy and how organisations can rebuild trust with stakeholders.
Thank you very much. So yes, obviously this is a complementary aspect to your crisis response and builds on everything that Jenny, Lucy and Charlie have already said. But it really is how you respond to issues that makes the difference. And yes, we'll be looking at sort of prevention, promotion and protection of a service's reputation when it's in struggle, but also starting to think about the short, medium and longer term as well. So moving on to the next slide, really, I think the key priority for any service, any business that finds themselves in a moment of crisis is preventing that from becoming a disaster. How do you stop that crisis in its tracks? How do you make use of the first 3 days of the crisis, and then really build towards smoothing that road to recovery? We all know that however well planned, however well intentioned a team is, how much you think you've got in place, no service can be 100% foolproof. It really is how you deal with the situation and how, as quickly as possible, you start to show that movement whilst also addressing the really immediate concerns. So just to pick up on 3 pillars, really. So if we just drop back of effective crisis communications. So looking more at protect, I think Charlie said this first, the first priority must be the people in your care, service users, making sure that above all, you've got that nailed down and that there are no further risks around that. But it's also thinking about your relationships, your organisation's reputation for that high quality service, even when you might be facing an issue, because it serves no one, including service users, to have a crisis turn into a disaster. Obviously, change is really, really hard, particularly in this sector. So I think that's something to really keep in mind. But at all times, there is that opportunity to promote what you're doing and your commitment to quality care, even when you are under pressure. So even when you are facing challenges, it's finding ways, whether that is to the regulator, to service users, families, etc., to demonstrate how you are being responsive, transparent, as people have already said, and that you are still a trusted provider, even if there may be issues you are managing. And then finally on that, really, it's prevention. So looking at whether you've got the right systems in place, and I think Charlie and Lucy, you both picked up on this in terms of the operational side, but have you thought ahead to what systems in place you need for communication specifically to minimise any further risk to your operations? And then going forward, where can you learn from areas of improvement? So just to anchor this, thought we'd provide a quick scenario of a service under the spotlight. So familiar, I'm sure, to some of you, or at least the idea of this. So imagine a CQC inspection has come through and there has been a requires improvement report rating. Concern cited around care planning and staff oversight. That report is now public. And there is a local BBC journalist making contact, requesting comment. Obviously, at the same time, this is meaning your staff are anxious, their morale is fragile. You've potentially got families on the phone, and commissioner in the situation has asked for an urgent meeting. So, all aspects of this, really, you feel like you're in the crisis moment. Obviously, you'll have to take your own steps around how you're responding to that report, but around communications, I think there are a few key questions to be asking. From our perspective, it would be looking at who you communicate first and actually what you're saying. Picking up on what Lucy and Charlie said, there'll be some things that you'll be saying to some of your stakeholders which may not suit others, and you really want to make sure that what you're saying is clear, it's consistent, it's credible and honest, but that it doesn't necessarily go too far. Within this, we would also recommend think early about where your legal team's advice might end and your communications response begins. These are different but complementary roles. Obviously, if you've got BBC News contacting you, that's a panic moment for many providers. So how do you respond? Who should speak? What can you say? Because that's often the challenge in situations like this. Have you got that clear action plan? But perhaps you don't want to share the sort of 5 to 10 page document that you might with those that are more closely linked to the service. One point on that is we frequently see, particularly when panic mode hits, that the sort of gut instinct would be to respond with a no comment, sort of shut down communications, and completely understandable from many ways, but actually that is probably the worst thing you can do in terms of making it look like you are not in control, not responsive. And then finally, how do you minimise the potential reputational damage and move on to that more positive future? So just one scenario there, but if we move on, I think there are a few areas that I really want to hone in on around getting communications right. So firstly, it's been said a lot, but it needs, repeating. Honesty is the most important thing. That transparency builds your credibility, even when the news might be hard. And obviously we've talked through some scenarios where there's, even more challenging situations. But even with sort of minor issues, if that needs to be communicated, be straightforward about it. But crucially, obviously, think about what it is that needs to be said. Transparency doesn't mean the kitchen sink in terms of communications. It's about really thinking through what individuals need to know and when. I think secondly, from a communications perspective, I would say timeliness of your response is really important. And a really important point here is that a fast response does show you're in control of the situation from a communications perspective, but a fast response doesn't mean jumping the gun and making, saying something that you can't back up, saying anything that you're not aware of, providing too much information. So always take a step back and think about what really needs to be said in a moment, but also don't shy away from that either. So I think that takes me on to proportionate. Proportionality is really important with these situations. And I think, once again, it's about finding the right balance, which again is something that we tend to work a lot with clients on. You need to match your response to the scale of the crisis. Otherwise, it's not going to land. And I think we can all think of examples where either on the one hand, a member of staff has put together something and has overblown a situation, where actually all was needed was a very calm, we're in control, this is how we are approaching things, and we've heard concerns and we're taking action. But likewise, where you're dealing with potentially really serious sort of safeguarding issues or things that can really have a knock-on impact, to have a response that goes out to any stakeholders that doesn't seem to get to the nub of the issue or really show that you've understood and heard the concerns raised, is also not going to cut it. And then finally, just again, obviously, we've got different perspectives here in terms of managing a crisis, but it's worth knowing your boundaries. So what support do you have in place? Who do you actually need to help you? And what should roles and responsibilities be? So obviously, as an example, legal teams will guide what can be said in a crisis situation often, but it will be communications that can help shape how you say it. And then a really important part, which I think often gets forgotten until that moment of crisis, is actually looking at who those stakeholders are. And I think for every service, and some do it fantastically and have a really clear sort of plan in place for when this might happen, but it's about understanding who matters most and identifying and then prioritising those stakeholders. And obviously every situation will be slightly different, but I think there's a few key things to remember here, which is mapping those key audiences from regulators, service users, families, other influencers who may have a bearing on whether a crisis turns into a bit of a reputational disaster. The media, your staff is a really crucial one, as others have said. They are sort of leading the charge and need to be brought with you. Often they're also a key interface with other external stakeholders. So it's really worth making sure that you've thought out and mapped who those people are. Secondly, tailoring approach. I've already picked up on a little bit of this, but whilst we would always say that communication should be consistent, you can't have contradictory communications going out. Different stakeholders will need different messages. Some will really need reassurance. Some will need higher levels of reassurance, i.e. information within that. Others just need to know that you've got a plan, you're on top of it, you're in control, and you're moving forward positively. And then others will really need more of the sort of more serious acknowledgement of concerns. So it is worth thinking about, with those different stakeholders, what do they need to hear? How would I feel if I were in their shoes in this position, and therefore how do I change my sort of argument and judgment to match? And then thirdly on this, be prepared to act and know when not to. So don't rush things, but be responsive, and don't say things that you can't say at different points, and then have a plan linked to your stakeholder map of how you'd actually get in touch with people. One of the things I find that in a crisis moment, pulling together contact details or knowing what mechanism people prefer best to use is actually the most stressful and time-consuming aspect of the communications, not the sort of draft itself. And then again, legal versus comms, it is those different roles, and so these may be things that you also, if you have got support from a legal perspective, or again from Lucy and Charlie's operational perspective, knowing within this who's best to take the lead, but who's also coordinating. So again, another quick scenario here, and I think this was mentioned at the top, is how frequently internal issues actually unaddressed or maybe not handled as well as we might have wanted to early on can become a public issue and an external potential reputational risk. So again, it's in many ways could be a minor issue. In fact, it could just be one unfortunate situation where maybe a staff error or judgment error, but actually this family here has now raised a serious complaint about the quality of care a relative has received. They are distressed, vocal, as we so often find these days. They're active on social media, and they've said they're going to contact their local MP. Others in the service have started to hear about this. Staff morale is low and being impacted. You've got an internal review underway, but you don't yet have all the facts. So again, here, we would really be thinking about, first, how do you engage with the family before this escalates? We've seen it, on both sides. Things can be really easily managed, mitigated by just really effective communications and engagement early on. But likewise, how that can escalate so quickly where, well-meaning or not, perhaps the first response hasn't met the kind of key communications aspects we just talked about. It wasn't proportionate, the tone wasn't quite there, it didn't seem to understand what they were actually saying. Secondly, obviously, if it's starting to leak out, what can you say publicly when an investigation isn't complete? So really just finding that balance while showing you're on board, an investigation is complete, but knowing that there's so much you can't say at this point, and perhaps thinking about in the sort of medium term, when could you say something? How do you feed back on an internal investigation, and who should hear about that? Thirdly, how do you deal with other families and staff? Obviously, no one wants to fuel speculation, but we all know situations where people have talked and there are sort of questions perhaps coming to different staff members, and they're saying to you, oh, how am I supposed to deal with that? So there is sort of ways and tactics that you could look at to try and address that without fueling speculation. And then finally, and again, this is a point that's been raised, but really important one, is who does lead on this internally? Do you have the right person managing the situation? It's not always the most senior one, we find, but it's someone that is really good at perhaps de-escalation, that knows the situation and is the right person to be handling it. And then obviously, what support do they have, whether internal or external? It's really worth thinking through. So just moving on really to that road to recovery. And if nothing else, I think communications it's about helping to rebuild trust, rebuild confidence in the service, and actually build advocacy more than anything else, because it's about those relationships that you've got and the people that have the confidence and trust in you to move from a situation of difficulty, of crisis, of an issue, to one of a smooth running road. So this is cutting across the short term, that quick reassurance piece, clear and consistent messaging, through to the medium term, thinking about how you plan in the embedding of change. How do you start to communicate that back without, again, reigniting any concerns about a crisis? How do you show accountability where you need to, but in an appropriate way? And then in the longer term, how do you turn that experience into stronger relationships, hopefully, and genuine advocates for the service you're providing? And just a final note to that, I would echo what's been said before. Don't wait for when a crisis comes. You make sure you have what you need to manage through challenging times before they hit, because the last thing you want to be doing is putting together a stakeholder map, pulling together contact details for everyone, really trying to work out who leads on an issue when you're in the moment. And if you don't think you've got that thought through, or you might need additional support, do you have those numbers you can call for people that know your business and will be able to step in really quickly if needed to support them through it?
Thanks so much, Sasha.
Okay.
That's so helpful. I think it's so pertinent now, because we're looking at a situation where the CQC hasn't inspected services for years. There's such a massive backlog. People are left with ratings from 2020, 2019. Yes. So people looking for services are relying on social media, they're relying on Google reviews, and in particular carehome.co.uk, which is a bit like a Trustpilot service. So what you're saying, it feeds into that, really. It's about getting that messaging out there and kind of nipping it in the bud before people go nuclear.
Yes.
On social media. I don't know how much there is to control how people react on social media, or whether people should be contacting Facebook to get posts taken down. But I guess it's about measured approaches, isn't it, when you're responding to things like that?
And it's, I think it's a bit of a mix. For instance, with social media, I think anyone who's tried to get things taken down, there are very strict criteria that you have to meet to get posts removed. And so often you have to, as frustrating as it might be, deal with the fact that there are going to be some negative comments and points out there However, the best thing that you can do is actually not in the crisis moment. I think it's about feeding those positive stories through. Comes back to what I was saying about prevention. That's not just about the communication systems and processes, although that's really important. It's actually about thinking how are we getting the good news out there, and not just keeping it within our existing sort of service community. Who needs to hear this and who could celebrate it? And it's the same with negative press coverage. One unfortunate story might not be stoppable. You can handle it as well as you can, but it's still going to be out there. People are going to see it when they're searching. But if you've reached out about an event for families that you've held where you had some good photos, or some interventions that you've made positively about care in the sector, I think there are ways to really try and plan for the longer term from a positive place of strength, rather than trying to do that when you're already feeling under pressure or from a place of weakness.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, spot on. It's so important to kind of toot our own horn, and I don't think the care sector is very adept at doing that, or used to kind of celebrating itself. So I think providers should be empowered to put those positive stories out there of their own volition, because the news around social care is largely negative, because it's cheap and easy headlines for local and national publications, especially with the CQC in particular. The other regulators not so much. They're a very press-focused beast, so they will circulate their own press releases when there's an adverse inspection or when they take enforcement action. So providers have to be ready to challenge that themselves, I guess.
Absolutely. And we are seeing, over the past few years, that's really increased, and it is unfortunate. But it's about how you manage it, and trying to find, I would say, that there's a bit of a gap sometimes between what services will see as the marketing activity and where we're coming at it, which is a bit more strategic in your communications. So how are you promoting your reputation with a view to really building it? So it's not pure marketing activity. You might not get new people through, but actually it's about laying the foundations for future.
And I think in turn we're talking about boosting staff morale. If staff are reading positive stories about the service for which they work, that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Sasha. So I think reflecting on our discussion, there are 3 key takeaways. Crisis response must be structured, documented, and defensible. Legal, operational, and communication strategies all dovetail. I think they have to align, and that goes back to Charlie's point about getting the right team in place. And recovery, even at the start of a crisis where everything seems overwhelming, recovery is possible, but only through transparent and strong leadership, clear evidence, and timely action. Lucy, Charlie, Sasha, I cannot thank you enough for lending us your expertise and chatting with us today. I'm sure people will have a lot to think about going away from this, and I would urge anybody with concerns or reflections to get in touch with us. You have our email information, so if you do have any questions that you're not comfortable asking here, please just get in touch. Thank you everybody for attending, taking the time out of your morning. If you want to reach out to Acuity Law, Cornerstone Care Solutions, 8HWE, then please do. You're welcome. We hope this session's been practical, actionable, and reassuring, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.